What if I told you that history's greatest breakthroughs and most devastating catastrophes were all just a matter of pure chance, from unwashed dishes saving millions of lives to a single wrong turn that sparked a world war? Today, we're diving into 20 incredible instances of pure chance that profoundly reshaped our world. Prepare to be amazed, because history isn't always a meticulously planned narrative. Often, it's a bewildering series of unlikely coincidences. We often think that history is shaped by great figures with grand designs, but often it's a single awkward moment, a forgotten detail, or just a stroke of pure luck, or terrible misfortune, that truly shifts the course of events. A tiny error can, like a domino, trigger a chain reaction whose ripple effects are felt for centuries. These are precisely the moments we're exploring today. So let's start with a story that, no exaggeration, saved millions of lives. This is a story about the incredible power of disorder. Imagine London, 1928. Scientist Alexander Fleming was about to go on vacation. His lab, let's just say, wasn't exactly sparkling clean. Before he left, he'd left a stack of petri dishes on his bench containing cultures of dangerous staphylococcus bacteria. As he departed, he apparently left a window ajar. And this is where sheer chance entered the equation. From another lab downstairs, the wind carried in spores of a rare mould. They landed in one of the dishes Fleming hadn't properly sealed. 2 weeks later, the scientist returns. He begins cleaning up his cluttered lab, preparing to discard the old cultures. But then, something in one of the dishes caught his eye. Around a patch of blue-green mould, a strikingly clear zone had formed. All the bacteria around it had died, as if wiped clean. A less observant person would have simply discarded the contaminated sample. But Fleming realised this mould was secreting something lethal to bacteria. And so, thanks to some untidiness and an open window, the world gained penicillin, the first antibiotic, saving hundreds of millions of lives. Truly, sometimes the greatest breakthroughs are hidden in the most unexpected disorder. Now, let's fast forward to the late 15th century. Trade with the East was a gold mine. Spices, silk and jewels fetched astronomical prices, but the overland routes were long and perilous. That's when the seasoned navigator, Christopher Columbus, put forward a bold proposition. Why bother sailing east when you could reach India by simply heading west? The Earth, after all, was round. A brilliant concept, right? However, there was one tiny little problem. His calculations were catastrophically flawed. Relying on outdated figures, he estimated the Earth to be nearly a third smaller than its actual size. He dismissed the more accurate findings of contemporary scientists and managed to convince the Spanish crown that Asia was practically just around the corner. When he finally sighted land, he was utterly convinced he had reached the islands off the coast of India. This is why he mistakenly called the native inhabitants Indians. To his dying day, he never admitted his error, embarking on 3 more voyages to what he believed was Asia. Thus, one of history's greatest navigational blunders ultimately gifted Europeans 2 entire new continents and forever altered the course of our world. Now let's transport ourselves back to June 28th, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. The air practically crackles with tension. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is on an official visit. A visit local nationalists view as a direct provocation. Earlier that morning, an assassination attempt on his motorcade had already occurred. One conspirator threw a bomb, but it bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded beneath the vehicle behind it, injuring several people. By all accounts, that should have been the end of it. But instead of immediately leaving the city, the Archduke, in a show of compassion, insisted on visiting the injured in the hospital. His route was hastily changed, and this is where a fateful twist of fate truly begins. Crucially, the driver of the lead car was either forgotten or simply not informed of this new route. Following the original plan, he takes a wrong turn off the main street. Shouts immediately erupt. "Wrong way! Go straight!" The bewildered chauffeur slams on the brakes, intending to turn the car around, and stops it barely a metre away from one of the conspirators, Gavrilo Princip. Princip, dejected after the morning's failure, had simply gone to a nearby deli to buy a sandwich. And there, right before his eyes, sits his target in a motionless vehicle. 2 shots ring out, 2 fatal impacts, 1 wrong turn, 1 sandwich, and the world was plunged into the inferno of World War I. But enough about the serious stuff. Let's shift gears and talk about a serendipitous accident that revolutionized our kitchens. The year was 1945. American engineer Percy Spencer was working for Raytheon, tasked with perfecting military radar technology. One day, while standing near an active magnetron, a device that generates microwaves, he reached into his pocket and felt something sticky. The chocolate bar in his pocket had completely melted. Anyone else might have been annoyed about their ruined treat, but Spencer was a true engineer. His mind immediately started churning. The very next day, he brought popcorn kernels into the lab. Aiming the magnetron at them, he watched in amazement as popcorn started flying all over the lab. The third victim of his experiment was an egg, which, to his colleagues' horror, promptly exploded. Spencer realized he had stumbled upon a completely new way to cook food. And so, thanks to a melted chocolate bar and a good dose of curiosity, the microwave oven was born, a device without which it's hard to imagine a modern home today. And now, for a tale of how one monk's greatest frustration blossomed into a symbol of celebration and luxury. Picture this: 17th century France in the heart of the Champagne region. A young monk named Dom Perignon served as the abbey's cellarer, overseeing its vast wine cellars. Back then, local winemakers grappled with a significant challenge. Due to the cold climate, wine fermentation would often halt during the winter months, only to resume in the spring as temperatures rose. This led to a buildup of carbon dioxide in the bottles, causing them to explode. These effervescent bubbles were considered a dreadful flaw, a sign of spoiled wine, and the exploding bottles earned the ominous nickname, the Devil's Wine. For years, Dom Perignon painstakingly tried to find a way to eliminate these dreaded bubbles and produce still wine. He experimented tirelessly with grape varieties, bottle thickness, and sealing methods. The great irony, however, is that all his attempts achieved precisely the opposite of what he intended. He so refined the process that the bubbles became even more persistent, and the wine even more effervescent. One fateful day, upon tasting the result of his failed endeavours, legend has it he exclaimed, "Come quickly, I am drinking stars." And just like that, a desperate battle against a perceived flaw gifted the world champagne. Let's journey back to ancient China, around the 9th century. Taoist alchemists were obsessed with the idea of immortality. They conducted hundreds of experiments, mixing all sorts of substances in their quest for a magical elixir that would grant eternal life. In their treatises, they meticulously documented recipes believed to lead to spiritual and physical perfection. Among these, one particular recipe called for mixing sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal. The alchemists hoped this mixture would help them achieve enlightenment. Well, enlightenment eluded them, but a bright flash certainly did not. Instead of the elixir of life, what they produced was a highly flammable and explosive powder. Their own accounts describe how the mixture flashed, singeing their beards and hands, and even burned down the house where they worked. Ironically, this substance, created in the pursuit of immortality, became one of the most lethal inventions in human history. Thus, a serendipitous chemical experiment gifted the world gunpowder, forever altering the art of war. Our next story proves that sometimes the greatest inventions are born out of pure frustration. The year is 1853 in America. At Moon's Lake House restaurant in Saratoga Springs, a chef named George Crumb was hard at work. That evening, one of his customers, railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, proved to be particularly demanding. He repeatedly sent back his order of fried potatoes, complaining they were sliced too thickly and not cooked enough. Crumb, known for his less-than-patient nature, eventually lost his temper. He decided to teach the finicky customer a lesson. Taking a potato, he sliced it as thin as humanly possible, almost transparent, Then he plunged these paper-thin slices into boiling oil until they turned into crispy, wafer-thin discs. Finally, he seasoned them liberally with salt and sent them out to the dining room, fully expecting an indignant reaction. But to his surprise, the effect was quite the opposite. Vanderbilt was absolutely delighted with the new dish. Other diners soon clamoured to try these Saratoga chips. And so, an annoyed chef's act of revenge on a demanding customer gifted the world one of its most beloved snacks, the potato chip. Here's a story about how a simple dog walk led to an invention found in almost every home. The year is 1941 in Switzerland. Engineer Georges de Mestral was returning home after a hunting trip in the Alps. As usual, his clothes and his dog's fur were covered in pesky burrs. Most of us would simply brush them off and forget about them. But de Mestral was an engineer through and through. His curiosity was piqued. He wondered why these burrs clung so stubbornly. Once home, he didn't just brush them aside. Instead, he took out his microscope to examine one. Under magnification, he saw not merely spikes, but hundreds of tiny, resilient hooks. These tiny hooks, he realised, were perfectly designed to latch onto the loops in his clothing fabric and his dog's fur. An idea immediately sparked in his mind. What if he could replicate this system artificially, one side with thousands of tiny hooks and the other with thousands of tiny loops? He spent nearly a decade experimenting, meticulously searching for the right materials. Eventually, he settled on nylon. And so, thanks to a curious engineer and those persistent burrs, the hook and loop fastener, better known as Velcro, was born. Today, it's an indispensable part of everything from children's shoes to astronaut spacesuits. Let's journey back to 1938 to a DuPont chemical laboratory. There, a young chemist named Roy Plunkett was hard at work trying to develop a new, non-toxic refrigerant for refrigerators. He was experimenting with tetrafluoroethylene gas, stored in small, pressurized cylinders. One morning, he grabbed one of these cylinders, opened its valve, and nothing happened. No gas flowed out. The cylinder, inexplicably, felt heavy, yet contained absolutely no gas. Plunkett was utterly baffled. Where had all the gas gone? Rather than simply discarding the seemingly faulty cylinder, he decided to cut it open. Inside, he discovered a strange, white, waxy powder. It felt incredibly slippery and proved remarkably resistant to almost everything: extreme temperatures, acids, and solvents. Plunkett soon realized that the gas molecules inside the cylinder had spontaneously polymerized, bonding together to form an entirely new substance, polytetrafluoroethylene. DuPont quickly patented this groundbreaking discovery under the brand name Teflon. And so, what began as a peculiar, seemingly failed experiment to improve refrigerators ultimately gave the world non-stick cookware, waterproof clothing, and even crucial components for spacecraft. This story is a prime example of just how important it is to wash your hands after work, especially if you're a chemist. The year was 1879 in the United States. Chemist Konstantin Fahlberg was working in a lab at Johns Hopkins University. All day he'd been experimenting with coal tar derivatives, a sticky, black, and foul-smelling substance. That evening, tired from his work, he headed home for dinner. Lost in thought, he apparently forgot to wash his hands thoroughly. Sitting down at the table, he picked up a piece of bread, took a bite, and froze in astonishment. The bread tasted incredibly, almost sickeningly sweet. He tried the water. It was sweet too. He touched his napkin, then his fingers to his lips. The sweetness was coming from his hands. Instead of panicking that he'd been poisoned, Fahlberg, ever the true scientist, rushed straight back to the lab. He began tasting the contents of every flask he'd worked with that day until he pinpointed the source of the sweetness. It was a substance he had synthesized, benzoic sulfamide. And so, thanks to a moment of forgetfulness and his scientific courage, saccharin was discovered. The world's first artificial sweetener, hundreds of times sweeter than sugar. The year is 1895, and our scene is set in Germany. Physicist Wilhelm Röntgen was conducting what seemed like a routine experiment in his laboratory. He was studying cathode rays, a stream of electrons inside a vacuum tube. To prevent any light from the tube from interfering with his observations, he meticulously covered it with thick black cardboard. The room was plunged into complete darkness. Then, as he turned on the current, he noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye. A couple of meters away from his apparatus, on a nearby table, something was emitting a faint green glow. It was a screen coated with a special substance, barium platinocyanide. But how could it glow? Cathode rays were known to be unable to penetrate the cardboard and the glass of the tube. Röntgen switched off the apparatus. The glow vanished. He turned it back on, and it reappeared. He realized he had stumbled upon a completely new form of radiation, unknown to science, capable of penetrating opaque objects. He placed his own hand in the path of these mysterious rays, and to his astonishment saw the dark shadows of his bones on the screen. Unsure what to call this unprecedented phenomenon, he simply dubbed them X-rays. Thus, a chance glow in a darkened room opened up a revolutionary possibility for humankind, to look inside a living body without a single incision. Now let's talk about perhaps the most famous architectural blunder in the world, a mistake that, against all odds, became an icon. It all began in Pisa, Italy, in 1173. Work started on a magnificent bell tower for the city's cathedral. The vision was grand, a striking white marble tower designed to reach nearly 60 meters tall. Architects and builders embarked on this ambitious project with great enthusiasm. But they made one critical misstep. They failed to account for the unique characteristics of the local soil. The foundation, a mere 3 meters deep, was laid directly onto soft, unstable ground composed of clay and sand. Problems emerged almost immediately. As builders completed the first 3 stories, the tower began to lean, slowly but inexorably, towards the south. Construction had to be halted for nearly a century. When work finally resumed, engineers attempted to correct the tilt. They designed subsequent floors with one side intentionally built higher than the other, hoping to straighten the structure. Instead, this only made the tower curve, giving it a distinct, banana-like shape. Ultimately, the tower's construction spanned 2 centuries. It continued to tilt, and by the 20th century, extensive efforts were required to save it from collapsing entirely. The profound irony is this: without that fateful miscalculation, the Leaning Tower of Pisa would likely be just one of countless beautiful Italian bell towers. Instead, its defect became its defining characteristic, drawing millions of tourists from across the globe. Our story begins in 1943 at a shipyard in Philadelphia. Richard James, a marine engineer, was developing a special device. He needed a spring that could stabilize sensitive instruments on ships, allowing them to function reliably even during the choppiest waters. He spent his days experimenting with various types of wire and coiling techniques. One afternoon, while working at his desk, he accidentally knocked over one of his test springs, but it didn't simply fall to the floor. Instead, it gracefully stepped off a stack of books, tumbled end over end through the air, landed on his desk, and then took another step onto the floor, where it finally came to rest. James was absolutely captivated. He completely forgot about ship instruments. He saw a spark of something extraordinary in that unexpected fall. He brought the spring home that evening to show his wife, Betty. Their children were instantly delighted by how the spring walked down the stairs. It was Betty who truly recognized the commercial potential. She scoured the dictionary for a fitting name and came across slinky, a word she found associated with a Swedish term meaning winding or fluid. And so, a simple accidental tumble of a spring from a desk gifted the world one of the simplest, yet most ingenious toys in history. This is the story of how a seemingly simple accident with a glass flask dramatically improved car safety. France, 1903. Chemist Edouard Benedictus is working in his laboratory. One day, he clumsily bumps into a glass flask on a shelf. It falls to the floor from a considerable height. Benedictus expects the usual crash of shattering glass, but instead, there's only a dull thud. He picks up the flask and is astonished to see that, while covered in a web of cracks like a spider web, it has completely retained its shape. Not a single shard has broken off. Intrigued, he remembers that he had previously used this flask for experiments with cellulose nitrate. The solution had evaporated, leaving a thin, almost invisible film on the inner surface of the glass. It was this film, he realized, that had held the pieces together, preventing the flask from scattering. A few weeks later, Benedictus read a newspaper article about a car accident in which a young woman was severely injured by flying shards from a shattered windshield. Suddenly, a brilliant idea struck him. He understood that his unbreakable flask held the key to saving lives. This was the birth of laminated safety glass, also known as triplex, a multi-layered shatter-resistant glass that is now standard in every car on the road today. Often, the most profound discoveries are found in the most unexpected places, sometimes simply by searching for a lost goat. In 1947, in the Judean desert, a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib was searching for a missing goat from his flock. His search led him to the rocky cliffs of Qumran, not far from the Dead Sea. Spotting a dark crevice in a cliff face, he wondered if his goat might have taken refuge inside. Hoping to coax it out, he threw a stone into the opening. But instead of a bleat, he heard an unexpected sound, the distinct clatter of breaking pottery. Curiosity quickly overtook his mission to find the goat. He cautiously entered the cave, and in the dim light saw several large clay jars. Inside one, he discovered ancient scrolls made of leather and papyrus, covered in unfamiliar writing. Unaware of their immense value, he and his companions sold the scrolls for a mere pittance to a local antiquities dealer. It was only later that scholars realized the shepherd had stumbled upon the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were the oldest known biblical manuscripts, crafted more than 2 millennia ago. And so, a single accidental stone throw opened a priceless window into humanity's ancient past. Our next story proves that sometimes what seemed like a spoiled product isn't a failure at all, but rather the beginning of something entirely new. It's late 19th century America. In Battle Creek, brothers John Harvey and Will Keith Kellogg ran a sanatorium. Ardent proponents of healthy living and vegetarianism, they were always on the lookout for innovative recipes to offer their patients. One day, while experimenting with a boiled wheat recipe, they cooked a batch of grains. However, an urgent matter called them away unexpectedly, and the wheat was simply forgotten. When they finally returned a few days later, the wheat had sat for too long and started to ferment, turning slightly sour. With the sanatorium operating on a modest budget, throwing away food was simply not an option. Even though the dough seemed ruined, they decided to run it through their special rollers anyway, hoping to salvage it and perhaps create long sheets of dough. But to their surprise, instead of sheets, individual thin flakes emerged from the press. Intrigued, the brothers decided to bake them. To their astonishment, what came out was a light, crispy, and delicious product. The sanatorium's patients absolutely loved this unexpected new treat. And so, thanks to a simple oversight and a reluctance to waste, the now famous, or rather, wheat flakes were born. A breakfast that would go on to change mornings for millions worldwide. Imagine a man so consumed by a single idea that he devotes his entire life to it, spends every last penny, and lives in utter poverty. That man was Charles Goodyear. In the first half of the 19th century, rubber was already known, but it had a significant drawback. In the heat, it turned into a sticky, foul-smelling mess, and in the cold, it became hard and brittle like glass. Goodyear was convinced he could tame rubber. He spent 10 years on fruitless experiments. He mixed rubber with everything imaginable: salt, pepper, magnesia, acid. He went so far as to sell his furniture and his children's schoolbooks to buy materials for his experiments. His family went hungry, and his neighbours considered him mad. Then, one winter day in 1839, while once again arguing with someone about the properties of rubber, he angrily waved a hand holding a lump of rubber and sulphur mixture. The piece accidentally fell onto a hot stove. Goodyear expected it to melt, but instead, the rubber charred around the edges, while the centre became resilient and elastic, like leather. It froze in the cold, yet it didn't become brittle. Thus, in a moment of anger, and by pure chance, the process of vulcanization was discovered, making possible the advent of car tyres and thousands of other rubber products. Sometimes the key to unlocking ancient mysteries lies right beneath our feet. All it takes is a lucky dig. It's 17999, Egypt. Napoleon Bonaparte's army is engaged in military campaigns. French soldiers, led by Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard, are busy fortifying an old outpost near the town of Rosetta. Their task is to dismantle a crumbling ancient wall, reusing its stones for new construction. It was dull, dusty work. But suddenly, one soldier noticed an unusual slab of black granite. It was covered in inscriptions. What was truly remarkable, however, was that the inscriptions were in 3 different languages. The top section was covered in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, a language no one at the time could decipher. The middle bore a later Egyptian demotic script, and the bottom section was written in well-known ancient Greek. Lieutenant Bouchard, an educated man, immediately grasped the significance of the find. This wasn't just a stone, it was a key. If the same text was inscribed on the slab in 3 languages, then by comparing the Greek section with the hieroglyphs, the language of the pharaohs could finally be deciphered. And so, a chance discovery during the fort's construction became the Rosetta Stone, ultimately unlocking the mysteries of ancient Egypt for the world. This is the story of how one scientist's failed invention became another's massive success. It was 1968, in a 3M company lab. A scientist named Spencer Silver was trying to develop a super strong adhesive for the aerospace industry. He needed a glue that could hold aircraft parts with an unyielding permanent bond. But the experiment failed. Instead of a super adhesive, he ended up with the exact opposite, a very weak glue. It was sticky, yet items bonded with it could be easily pulled apart without leaving any residue. What's more, it could be repeatedly stuck and unstuck. Company management saw no potential in this unusual substance, and the project was shelved. Several years later, Spencer Silver's colleague Art Fry was singing in his church choir. He had a recurring problem. The paper bookmarks he used to mark hymns in his hymnal kept falling out. One Sunday, during a service, as he mused over this small annoyance, he suddenly recalled Spencer Silver's useless invention. What if he could put that weak adhesive on a piece of paper? It would stay in the book without damaging the pages, and he could reposition it as needed. The idea was brilliant. And so, from a failed super adhesive and a church singer's everyday problem, the iconic post-it notes were born. Our final story is perhaps the most psychedelic of them all. It began in a Swiss pharmaceutical laboratory in 1938. Chemist Albert Hofmann was studying derivatives of the ergot fungus, attempting to create a new medication to stimulate blood circulation. During his research, he synthesized the 25th substance in the series, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25 for short. Animal tests yielded no remarkable results, apart from some mild agitation. The substance was deemed unpromising and put aside, where it remained for 5 years. But in 1943, an inexplicable intuition prompted Hofmann to revisit the compound. While working with it in the lab, he suddenly felt strange. He became uneasy, experienced dizziness, and saw a continuous flow of fantastic imagery and kaleidoscopic patterns. He concluded he must have accidentally absorbed a tiny dose of the substance through his fingertips. To verify his hunch, 3 days later, he decided to conduct an experiment on himself, taking what he believed to be an infinitesimally small dose, 250 micrograms. The effect far surpassed all his expectations, sending him on humanity's first ever LSD trip. Thus, the accidental absorption of a chemical through the skin unveiled to the world one of the most potent and controversial psychoactive substances. But if we stop to consider, which of these chance events were truly the most pivotal? Undoubtedly the wrong turn in Sarajevo. Think about it. One simple, everyday action by a driver, lost in an unfamiliar city, led to a shot that was heard around the world. Entire empires crumbled, the world map was redrawn in blood, and the 20th century began with what was, at the time, the most devastating war in history, all because of one wrong turn. On the other hand, consider a dirty petri dish in Alexander Flemings' lab. This mess was the complete opposite of war. It didn't destroy, it saved. Think of every modern surgery, every life saved from sepsis or pneumonia. The foundation of modern medicine and antibiotics was born from ordinary mould, left to grow by accident. It proves that humanity's greatest gifts can often be found in the most ordinary chaos. And then, of course, there was Columbus's error. He died never realizing he hadn't found a new route to Asia, but an entirely new world. This navigational blunder launched the age of exploration, the clash of civilizations, the dawn of globalization, and sadly, tragedy for indigenous peoples. The world we live in today, with its political alliances, economies, and cultures, is a direct consequence of one captain being incredibly wrong in his calculations. As you can see, history isn't a straight line. It's a tangled web of intentions, mistakes, and pure chance. One wrong step, one forgotten detail, and our world could have been entirely different. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you found it interesting, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more fascinating stories. It really helps us out. Which chance event from our list surprised you the most? Or perhaps you know of another example we missed? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to read your thoughts.